Shabbat Shira is a very special Shabbat because it is all about the two songs that will be read tomorrow morning during Shabbat services. The first is Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. That is in the Torah portion in the book of Exodus. And then in the Haftarah portion, we hear the Song of Deborah. Deborah is the great judge who is one of the great women of Jewish history. And if you come to either Chevra Torah and Shabbat morning services, you will hear the difference in the melody of Shabbat Shira, the Az Yashir Moshe, the Song of the Sea. Mateo is going to be chanting it tomorrow morning. It's a different melody. It's its own melody, very unique and one of a kind, and very beautiful. In fact, the arrangement of the trope, of the cantillation for Az Yashir was used in the movie Prince of Egypt, in that they took the arrangement of the words from the Torah and then transposed it onto the song that the animated movie has at that point when the Israelites are crossing the Red Sea, which is kind of cool. But when we think of the song, we think of Shabbat Shira, and when we think of Shabbat Shira, we think of the song, but we don't think, because in Reformed congregations, we do not have daily minyanim in the morning. This song is sung every single morning. It's sung every morning. It's in the prayer book in the section called Pesukei de Zimra, which is the warm-up service, the service before the service. And not just the Michamocha, which we know is in the song and is part of our services all the time, but not Az Yashir, the full song, can be found every morning in the service. If we listen carefully to the narrative, we can distinguish two different perspectives. One is we read in Exodus 14, and Mateo will be chanting tomorrow morning. It says, "The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea onto dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left." It's a beautiful image that has been depicted in, of course, movies, but mostly in our collective memory, because, of course, we were all there. At least the DNA of the Jews this story is in the DNA of the Jews, and therefore we were all there in our collective soul and our collective spirit. These two walls, gigantic walls of water. And the Torah continues, "The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. They were all obliterated. But the Israelites," the Torah teaches, "went through the sea onto dry ground with a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left." This great, wonderful, this supernatural miracle where God creates walls around the Israelites, walls of safety, safe passage, and the Egyptians not so much. And the same note is also later on in the Song of the Sea. The same note is struck where it says in the song itself, that was a descriptive, that wasn't in the Az Yashir, in the song itself. But in the song it says, "By the blast of your nostrils," your, capital Y, God's nostrils, "the waters piled up on top of each other. The surging waters stood firm like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea." So in the preamble to the Song of the Sea, we get a description in the narrative portion, in the prose, if you will, of this section, about these two walls, and then no walls for the Egyptians, of course. And in the poetry of the song, in the song itself, we have another reference to God's nostrils, this air coming from the nostrils of God. Of course, God has no body, but this is one of those few times in the Torah where God is described as having a body part, in this case a nose, where the blast of his nostrils, where God's nostrils surge the waters and they stand up like a wall. So we've got two descriptives of what happens at the event. And the intentions are different. In one, there is a supernatural dimension, this godly dimension in the poetry section. But in the prose section, it's more of a natural occurrence, where the nostrils of God are not mentioned, where it seems like it can be a little bit more natural. if we listen carefully, we can also hear a different part of it. Because it says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night Adonai drove back the sea with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. Now we hear a really sort of natural weather occurrence. Almost a meteorological event is given to us in Exodus 14, which is also in the preamble to the song, where Moses stretches his hand out over the water, and we know the story as it goes with Moses stretching out his hand with the staff and the water parts. But there's no apparent cause in this meteorological phenomenon, in that God brings a wind that in the course of several hours drives the water back. And then, one more verse. I mean, there's all these descriptions. We just think Moses went, put his staff in, Splitsville, right? The sea splits. This great miracle. But there's one more accounting. During the last watch of the night, Adonai looked down from the pillar of fire and the cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. God made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they couldn't drive. And this was depicted in that movie, if you remember, from a couple years ago, Exodus, Gods and Kings, where you can see the chariots are all messed up, and the wheels are falling off, and stuff's flying all over the place, and Egyptians are flying all over the place. It was really depicted probably most accurately in that movie. But it continues. The Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. God is fighting for them against Egypt. It's really the first time the Egyptian army, not the Pharaoh, but the Egyptian army recognizes that God is sort of a mighty foe, and they better scram. They better get out of there. The emphasis on that is less on the miracle than on the irony, which is the great military Egyptians, the great military assets of the Egyptians, making them invulnerable in there. I mean, Egypt was, in ancient times, the most powerful nation and with the greatest army. But now their horses and their chariots are tripping up and flying all around. These were Egypt's specialty, were their chariots. That's why they won so many wars and why they were so strong. And these different stories, these different accountings of the story, both prose and poetry, give us a lot of confusion and a lot of pause as to what really happened. Was it a natural event or was it a supernatural event? Was it a military defeat because their equipment wasn't working right, or were the Israelites, as the Egyptians reported, just that powerful, not to be messed with? The first time in the Torah that is recognized by a foreign nation, by an enemy army, that the Israelites are not to be messed with. And so we're confused, because we like it when the Torah says A plus B equals C. And in this, it's A plus B plus C plus D minus one of the above, including could be all of the above, may not be. We want evidence. We want to know. Mateo's going to talk tomorrow morning a little bit about the natural version, how there could have been a natural meteorological phenomenon. And so you have to come to hear Mateo Drash tomorrow morning to see exactly what it is that he's talking about. But let's put it this way, to deconstruct these passages a little bit. In the case of the wind that exposed the ridge and the bed of the sea, the consequence was dramatic. Suddenly the Israelites, who were walking on foot, had this great advantage over the Egyptians in that the chariots that were pursuing them had wheels that were flung all over the place, stuck in the mud. The chariot drivers made efforts to free them, only to find that they quickly became stuck in the mud again. The Egyptian army couldn't advance, and it couldn't retreat. By the time they realized what was happening, they were, as it were, stuck in the mud, covered with seawater in every direction, and they died. There's another way, this mighty army, by the way, I mean, this is the great part of the story. The mightiest army in the world at that time was defeated. It was strong, and then it was stuck, and then they drowned. But there's another way. So that is sort of the natural versus natural. The supernatural explanation that the waters were standing upright, as reported in the poem itself, is very powerful. One is the Egyptian army simply fell apart. That is sort of the more natural. And the supernatural is that there was this great wall of water that was provided by the nostrils, a wind from the nostrils of God. And the natural explanation of the Israelites, they're both compelling. So what happened? Well, one of the things that we learn is in this story that the weakness of the Israelites became their strength, and the strength of the Egyptians became their weakness, no matter how you read it. And that is the point of what I'm trying to explain, that you can give it as many reasons and explanations. The miracle itself, natural and supernatural, military and not. But at the end of the day, the Israelites' weakness became their strength, and the strength of the Egyptians became their weakness. What was significant was less the supernatural than the moral dimension of what happened. God punishes the Egyptians. God takes their strength, their army and their might, their idea or self-idealization that they were the greatest, strongest. The Pharaoh thought he was God. The Egyptian army thought they were God's army. But they were turned completely upside down. God mocks those who mock God. He shows the Egyptian army, which reveled in its might, that the weak were stronger than they, just as later God did with other prophets, false prophets in the Torah. These people, these Egyptians, were taught, you don't mess with God's people, and you don't mess with God. And so it's not just the miracle. We have to put it another way. A miracle cannot be seen necessarily as something that suspends natural law. I think we focus too much on the miracle when we read the story of the splitting of the Red Sea, the miracle of the splitting itself, and we miss the bigger picture, the moral. It is rather an event, the splitting of the sea, for which there may be a natural explanation of what's happening, when, where, and how it did. Evokes a lot of thought and a lot of wonder, but there is something underneath the miracle, this idea of the weak becoming strong and the strong becoming weak. The weak, in this case, our ancestors, the Israelites, are saved. Those who are most in danger are rescued. Later we hear on the wings of an eagle. The weak is saved. More significantly, in this moral message, the hubris is punished by its nemesis. The proud are humbled, and the humbled given pride, that there is justice in history, often hidden, but sometimes gloriously and miraculously revealed. And that is the story for our day, for our time, for what it is that we confront in our world. The message and the moral is oftentimes in a time of war, and the war itself now is terrorism. The war itself is those who would act in ways that are not only abhorrent, but are not only damaging, but in ways that go against God's will. And it's important for us to remember this story, especially at a time when our world is going in chaos, that God will ultimately prevail, that the weak will become strong and the strong will become weakened. This is not just an act of faith. You do not have to just believe in miracles. You only have to read history. And the history of the Israelites teaches us that the humbled, those who are strong becoming humbled and those who are weak becoming strong, is a natural part of the human narrative, of the human story. The genius of this story of the crossing of the Sea of Reeds is that it does not resolve the issue one way or another. It's not just about miracles, and it's also about miracles. It's not just about supernatural events, but it's also all about the fact that sometimes miracles do happen and don't happen. But we get both perspectives in this story. As we see the world around us falling apart, we may pray for a miracle, or in a more concrete way, for a savior, for a nation, a leader, a country, to defeat those who are evil. Some of us pray for miracles, and some of us think the only way to defeat them is a miracle. But most of us think that someone's got to step up. We have both perspectives in the story of the Sea of Reeds. To some, the miracle was the suspension of the laws of nature, these walls of water in God's nostrils. But to others, there was the fact that there was a naturalistic explanation, and it did not make the event any less awesome, any less miraculous. that the Israelites should arrive at the sea precisely where the waters were unexpectedly shallow and the strong east wind came and this natural event took place is one thing. But that the Egyptians' greatest military asset should have proved to be their undoing, the irony of that, all of these things were wonders. And we've never forgotten them. And so on this Shabbat, what I want you to do in reading the Song of the Sea and in confronting the realities of our world is to look both at the prose and the poetry and to realize that miracles are not the end-all and be-all of the story, but that miracles come in many forms. Supernatural, divine intervention, whatever you want to call it, you can be the miracle. We can be the miracle. Those of us who fight for and believe in justice and equality and peace and human dignity and integrity and the rule of law, those of us can collectively become the miracle, because that in and of itself, a world that is guided by those principles, is a miracle. Not the kind of miracle that comes from God, but the miracle that comes from human society. On this Shabbat, I want you to think about both the prose and the poetry. It's not enough to look at the story of the splitting of the sea as a miracle, but it's not enough to see it as a natural event. Please, on this Shabbat, the rest of the year you can, don't get so caught up on what happened or how it happened, but that it did happen. That is the lesson of this Shabbat, of Shabbat Shirah. It did happen. And we were there. And it can happen again. But we have to will it. We have to believe it. And we have to be the miracle itself. Shabbat Shalom.